Story number 1. Echoes of the Frozen Lake. I've always been captivated by the allure of untouched wilderness, the kind that strips away the superficial layers of civilization, leaving you bare and vulnerable to the raw forces of nature. It was this very fascination that led me, along with my wife Maria, to embark on a winter camping trip to one of Russia's most remote and enigmatic frozen lakes. Little did we know, the serene beauty of the icy expanse would become the backdrop for a nightmare we could never have imagined. The journey to Lake Sneguraka was arduous. We traveled by train for hours. The landscape outside my window a monotonous stretch of snow-covered fields and dense forests. The excitement in Maria's eyes was contagious, a stark contrast to my own sense of apprehension. As we approached our destination, the air grew colder, biting at our skin and seeping into our bones. The lake lay nestled in a secluded valley, its surface a mirror of pristine ice reflecting the pale winter sky. Setting up camp was both exhilarating and daunting. The ground was hard beneath our boots, the snow compacted by the weight of countless footsteps from those who had ventured here before us. We pitched our tent near the shore, the stillness of the surroundings amplifying every sound, the crunch of snow underfoot, the distant call of a lone owl, and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. That first night was everything we had hoped for. Maria and I sat by the small fire, wrapped in thick blankets, sipping hot cocoa as we admired the star-studded sky. The silence was comforting, a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of our everyday lives. We talked about everything and nothing, the warmth of the fire and each other's company creating a sense of peace that felt almost surreal in the heart of such isolation. As midnight approached, the temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl with increasing intensity. The flames of our fire danced wildly, casting long, flickering shadows on the snow-covered ground. It was then that we first heard it, a faint, rhythmic knocking emanating from the depths of the lake. At first, we dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on our ears, the sound perhaps the result of ice shifting beneath the surface. But the knocking persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing minute. The air around us seemed to grow colder, the chill penetrating deeper than before, making us pull our blankets tighter. Maria's laughter faded, replaced by a nervous silence as we listened intently to the mysterious sounds. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking was no longer faint, it was deliberate, almost methodical, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with us from beneath the ice. The tension between us was palpable, the once serene night now thick with unease. Determined to uncover the source of the sound, I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the edge of the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the frozen expanse of the lake. Every step I took towards the shore felt heavier, the cold seeping into my gloves and numbing my fingers. Maria followed close behind, her presence a reassuring anchor in the growing storm of fear. As we reached the water's edge, the knocking ceased abruptly, leaving us in a sudden, oppressive silence. The wind still howled, but the lake was eerily calm, the surface of the ice smooth and unbroken. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and directed the flashlight towards the center of the lake. That's when I saw it, a pale, ghostly face pressed against the ice, eyes hollow and devoid of life, staring back at us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Maria gasped, clutching my arm in terror. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, the face dissolved into the ice, leaving behind only ripples that slowly faded away. The sight was so surreal, so horrifying, that for a moment, I couldn't process what I had seen. My mind raced with questions. Was it a hallucination brought on by the extreme cold? Or something far more sinister? We stood there, frozen in place. The memory of the ghostly apparition burned into our minds. The air around us felt charged with an unseen presence, the cold now biting with a malicious intent. Without another word, we turned and fled back to the safety of our tent. the howling wind now seeming to carry whispers of sorrow and warning. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and sleeplessness. Every sound outside our tent heightened our anxiety. The howling wind now accompanied by faint, mournful cries that echoed through the frozen landscape. Maria clung to me, her eyes darting nervously around the tent, while I struggled to maintain some semblance of calm. Morning brought a stark contrast to the horrors of the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a serene yet haunting stillness. The lake was pristine, the ice unmarred by the turmoil of the previous night. We packed up our gear, the experience leaving an indelible mark on our spirits. As we prepared to leave, we noticed small, round footprints leading away from our campsite and into the dense forest. They were unlike any animal tracks we had seen, human-like but unnaturally small and perfectly circular. A sense of dread settled over us as we realized that the apparition we had witnessed was not just a figment of our imagination. The footprints were fresh, leading deeper into the wilderness, as if someone or something had been observing us throughout the night. We decided to follow the trail, hoping to uncover more clues about the mysterious presence that had haunted our camp. The journey through the forest was tense, the snow crunching under our boots as we ventured further into the unknown. The footprints guided us through dense thickets and over frozen streams, leading us to a secluded clearing that seemed untouched by time. In the center stood an old, abandoned cabin, its windows shattered and doors hanging ajar. The air around it was thick with an oppressive energy, making every step towards it feel like wading through molasses. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating. The remnants of past occupants lay scattered on the floor, frozen expressions of fear etched onto their faces, their belongings encased in ice. The walls were adorned with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light, adding to the eerie ambience of the place. It was here that we discovered the tragic history of Lake Sneguraka, a site of a brutal massacre that had occurred decades ago, where a group of villagers had perished under mysterious circumstances during a relentless winter. The legends spoke of a vengeful spirit, the ghost of a woman wronged and left to suffer in the frozen wilderness. Her sorrow had bound her to the lake, her restless spirit forever seeking justice and peace. The realization hit us hard. Our encounter was not an isolated incident, but a continuation of the tragic story that had unfolded on these frozen shores. Determined to honor the memory of those lost and free the spirit from her eternal torment, we decided to perform a ritual of remembrance. Using the symbols we had found in the cabin, we chanted prayers and laid offerings by the water's edge, hoping to soothe the restless spirit and bring closure to the lingering anguish. As we completed the ritual, the air around us began to change. The oppressive energy lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and serenity. The frozen face on the lake seemed to soften, her hollow eyes now filled with gratitude and peace. A gentle breeze swept across the water, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter and whispers of hope. Relieved and humbled by the experience, we left the forest with a newfound respect for the untamed forces of nature and the lingering spirits that inhabit its depths. The footprints had guided us to the truth, and in doing so, we had become a part of the lake's enduring legacy. Years have passed since that fateful winter, but the memory of Lake Sneguraka remains vivid in my mind. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right and the snow begins to fall, I catch a glimpse of a pale face on the frozen surface, a reminder of the night when the wilderness revealed its darkest secrets. The legends of the haunted lake continue to grow, a chilling testament to the enduring power of sorrow and the eternal quest for peace. Story number 2. Whispers in the Cursed Forest. I've always been fascinated by the untamed beauty of Sweden's wilderness. The dense forests, blanketed in snow during winter, hold a serene yet haunting allure that draws adventurers like moths to a flame. In the winter of 2017, my friends and I, Emma, Lucas, Sophia, and myself, decided to embark on a camping trip deep into one of Sweden's most remote forests, a place locals ominously referred to as Den Forbannade Skogen, or the cursed forest. Our decision wasn't born out of superstition but rather a shared love for nature and the thrill of exploration. Equipped with our tents, sleeping bags, and ample supplies, we set out early December, eager to disconnect from the chaos of modern life and immerse ourselves in the tranquil embrace of the wilderness. The journey to our campsite was arduous. We trekked through knee-deep snow, the biting cold numbing our fingers and toes despite the layers of clothing we wore. By late afternoon, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the forest. We found a suitable spot near a frozen lake, its surface shimmering under the pale light of the moon. As we set up our tents, the air grew colder, and an uneasy silence settled around us, broken only by the occasional crackle of our campfire and the distant call of a lone owl. That first night was deceptively peaceful. We huddled around the fire, sharing stories and laughing, the warmth from the flames a comforting barrier against the freezing temperatures. However, as midnight approached, a profound stillness enveloped the forest. The usual nocturnal sounds, the rustling of leaves, the scurrying of small animals were conspicuously absent. It was in this unnerving silence that we first heard it, a faint, rhythmic knocking coming from the edge of our campsite. First, we dismissed it as the wind or a branch tapping against our tent. Probably just the trees swaying, Emma suggested, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. But the knocking persisted, growing louder and more deliberate with each passing minute. The air around us seemed to grow colder, the chill penetrating deeper than before, making us pull our blankets tighter. "Did you guys hear that?" Sophia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking was no longer faint. It was insistent, almost methodical, as if someone or something was trying to communicate with us from the darkness. The tension between us was palpable, the once serene night now thick with unease. Lucas, ever the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the edge of the tent. "I'm going to check it out," he announced, his voice steady despite the growing fear. With a deep breath, he unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife. For a moment, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the thick blanket of snow and the towering trees that loomed overhead. But then, Lucas froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Guys, you need to see this," he called back, his voice trembling. We gathered around, our collective breath visible in the frigid air. On the snow-covered ground lay a series of small, perfectly round footprints leading away from our tent and deep into the forest. They were unlike any animal tracks we had seen, human-like but unnaturally small and symmetrical. A chill ran down my spine as I realized these footprints were moving, disappearing into the depths of the forest as if the walker had vanished into thin air. Before we could react, a shadowy figure emerged from between the trees, a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. Her face was pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and filled with an emptiness that seemed to pierce through the darkness. She stood a few meters away from us, staring intently before raising a hand and pointing toward the mountain range that bordered the forest. Lucas, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, tried to approach her, but she vanished before his eyes, swallowed by the swirling snow. The temperature dropped further, our breaths turning to visible puffs in the cold air. The eerie silence returned, broken only by the howling wind that now carried the faint sound of a sorrowful wail. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something's not right here." But before we could gather our things, the forest seemed to come alive. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers trying to ensnare us. The ground beneath our feet became slick with ice, making each step treacherous. The footprints began to reappear, circling our campsite in an endless loop, as if the mysterious woman was orchestrating a sinister dance around us. Desperate to escape, we hurriedly packed up our gear, our movements frantic and uncoordinated. As we loaded our supplies into the van, the howling wind intensified, the sorrowful wails growing louder and more menacing. Suddenly, the van's engine sputtered and died, leaving us stranded in the heart of the cursed forest. Panic set in as the temperature continued to plummet, our breaths becoming shallow and rapid. The footprints had led us here, to a place where the forest seemed to conspire against us, trapping us in its icy grip. We huddled together inside the van, the walls closing in as the cold seeped into our bones, our hearts pounding with fear and desperation. Hours passed in a haze of terror, the howling wind now accompanied by the sound of footsteps surrounding the van. The door rattled violently, as if something or someone was trying to break through. The flashlight on the dashboard flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the interior walls. Maria, our friend who had been quiet throughout the ordeal, suddenly screamed, a blood-curdling sound that pierced the night. We rushed to her side, finding her trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw her again," she gasped. "She's watching us, waiting for us." Before we could respond, the van's lights went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The only sound was the relentless beating of our hearts and the mournful wails that echoed through the forest. We sat in stunned silence, the reality of our situation sinking in. We were trapped in a place haunted by a vengeful spirit, with no way to escape. As dawn broke, the storm began to subside, the oppressive darkness giving way to the cold, harsh light of day. The footprints had vanished, and the eerie presence that had tormented us throughout the night was gone. Exhausted and traumatized, we managed to start the van's engine and drive back to civilization. The haunted memories of that night etched into our souls. Weeks later, I sought out the local villagers, desperate for answers. They listened in silence, their faces grave as I recounted our ordeal. An elderly man named Sven finally spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow. "You've encountered the spirit of Ellen, a young woman who lost her life in a tragic winter many centuries ago. She was wrongfully accused of witchcraft and hunted down by the villagers. Her spirit remains bound to the forest, seeking justice and peace." The realization hit me hard. We had disturbed the restless spirit of Ellen, and the forest had exacted its price. The villagers advised us to stay away, to respect the sanctity of the land and the spirits that dwelled within. But the damage was already done. Our lives forever changed by the encounter with the haunted forest. Years have passed since that fateful winter, but the memory of Ellen's sorrow and the haunted footsteps still linger in my mind. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right and the snow begins to fall, I catch a glimpse of a pale figure walking through the trees, her eyes hollow and filled with eternal sorrow. The cursed forest stands as a grim reminder of the fragile boundary between the living and the dead, a place where legends come to life and the past refuses to be forgotten. I often find myself staring into the depths of the forest, wondering if Ellen's spirit is still searching for peace, forever bound to the land that betrayed her. The haunted whispers of Den Forbannade Skogen echo in my heart, a chilling reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, their secrets buried beneath layers of snow and time. Story number 3. The Uninvited Guest of Colorado Peak. I've always been drawn to the mountains, their majestic silence, the way they stand as eternal sentinels against the sky. So, when my friend Mark and I decided to challenge ourselves with a winter camping trip to one of Colorado's most remote peaks in early 2005, felt like the perfect adventure. We were both seasoned hikers, accustomed to the solitude and harshness of the wilderness. But nothing could have prepared us for what awaited us on that cold December night. The journey to the base of Colorado Peak was arduous. We drove through winding mountain roads, the landscape transforming from dense pine forests to barren, snow-covered expanses. By late afternoon, we reached our designated campsite, a small clearing nestled between towering cliffs and a frozen lake that mirrored the gray winter sky. The air was crisp, each breath a visible puff in the fading light. We set up our tents with practiced efficiency. The rhythmic snap of poles and the flapping of tent fabric blending into the natural symphony of the wilderness. As dusk settled, we built a fire, its warm glow a comforting contrast to the encroaching darkness. We shared stories and laughed, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on our faces. Mark unpacked his camera, eager to capture the serene beauty of the snowy landscape, while I organized our gear, ensuring everything was in order for the night ahead. The first few hours were peaceful. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the pines and the occasional call of a distant owl. We ate dinner by the fire, the simplicity of the moment grounding us in the present. As the night deepened, the temperature plummeted, and the wind grew more insistent, whipping the snow into frenzied spirals around our campsite. By midnight, exhaustion had settled in, and we decided to retreat to our tents for some much-needed rest. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the warmth of the fire still lingering in my bones, while Mark and I exchanged tired smiles before drifting off to sleep. But our peace was short-lived. In the dead of night, a piercing sound shattered the silence. Sharp, frantic scratching against the fabric of our tent. My heart raced as I jolted awake, the memory of our comfortable slumber now replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I nudged Mark, whispering, "Did you hear that?" He nodded, eyes wide with fear. "Yeah, it sounded like something's trying to get in." We lay still, listening as the scratching continued, growing louder and more aggressive. It wasn't the random noise of a branch scraping against the tent. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone or something was clawing at the barrier between our sanctuary and the unknown. Minutes felt like hours as we lay paralyzed with fear, the sounds escalating until they felt like a violent assault on our senses. Finally, Mark whispered, "I think we need to check it out." With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent flap, the cold night air biting at my skin. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the campsite into near-total darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom as we cautiously stepped outside. The snow around us was pristine, untouched except for the chaotic, large footprints leading away from our tents and disappearing into the dense forest. "Let's follow them," Mark suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe someone is lost or injured." We trudged through the knee-deep snow, the footprints guiding us deeper into the heart of the forest. The air grew colder, the wind howling louder as if warning us to turn back. My flashlight flickered, threatening to die as the batteries drained. But we pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged into a small clearing illuminated by the weak light of our flashlights. There, standing at the center, was a figure unlike anything we had ever seen, towering over us. It was a man, or something resembling a man, clad in a thick, weathered coat that seemed to merge with the surrounding snow. His presence was both terrifying and surreal, his form barely distinguishable from the white landscape around him. As we stared in horror, the figure raised a hand and pointed toward the mountain range. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural red light, bore into our souls, freezing us in place. The cold around us intensified, our breaths visible in the frigid air as a sense of impending doom washed over us. "We need to go," I managed to stammer, my voice barely audible over the howling wind. Before we could react, the figure began to dissolve into the snow, the red glow fading until there was nothing left but the pristine white landscape. Shaken to our core, we hurried back to our campsite, the footprints now leading us away from the clearing and back into the forest as if mocking our encounter. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was suffocating. The temperature had dropped further, our gear frozen and our bodies numb from the extreme cold. We huddled together, trying to warm up, but the fear lingered, the memory of the glowing eyes and the imposing figure haunting our thoughts. As dawn broke, the storm outside began to subside, leaving behind a serene yet eerie stillness. We packed up our gear, the footprints having vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. The experience left us both physically exhausted and mentally scarred. The boundary between reality and nightmare forever blurred. Driving back to civilization, we were silent, the weight of what we had witnessed pressing down on us. The stories of the cursed forests and restless spirits we had once dismissed as folklore now felt all too real. By the time we reached the safety of the city, we were both changed, our once adventurous spirits now tempered by the chilling encounter on Colorado Peak. In the weeks that followed, Mark and I couldn't shake the memory of that night. We both felt a presence lingering in our lives, an invisible weight that reminded us of the spirit we had encountered. Friends and family noticed our change, the haunted look in our eyes, and the sleepless nights spent staring into the darkness. Years have passed since that fateful winter, but the scars remain. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right and the snow begins to fall, I catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the corner of my eye, his red eyes burning with eternal sorrow and rage. The legends of Colorado Peak have become a part of my reality, a constant reminder of the thin line that separates the living from the dead, and the unforgiving nature of the wilderness that holds its secrets close. Mark and I never returned to those mountains, our bond strengthened by the shared trauma of that night. We moved on with our lives, but the haunting presence of that uninvited guest continues to echo in our minds, a chilling testament to the power of the unknown and the spirits that dwell within the heart of the wilderness. Story number 4. Nightmare on Appalachian Mountain. I've always been drawn to the solitude that only the mountains can offer. The Appalachian Range, with its dense forests and rugged peaks, promised an escape from the chaos of everyday life. In the winter of 1998, my friends and I decided to embark on a camping trip deep into these woods, seeking tranquility and adventure. Little did I know, the mountains held secrets far darker than we could have ever imagined. We arrived at the base of Appalachian Mountain on a crisp December afternoon. The sky was a dull gray, the clouds heavy with unshed snow. Our destination was an old campsite rumored to be secluded and untouched by modern trails. Armed with our gear, we set up camp near a frozen stream, the silence around us only broken by the occasional crackle of our campfire and the distant call of a lone owl. The first few days were idyllic. We hiked through pristine snow, marveled at the untouched beauty, and shared stories under the starlit sky. The air was fresh, each breath invigorating, filling us with a sense of peace we hadn't felt in years. But as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, an uneasy tension began to settle over us. On the third night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, the temperature inside our tent plummeted despite the fire blazing outside. I pulled my blanket tighter, trying to fend off the chill that seemed to seep into my bones. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, a piercing scream shattered the silence. It echoed through the mountains, a raw, anguished sound that sent shivers down my spine. My heart racing, I sat up and glanced around the tent. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered to my friends, who were already wide awake, eyes darting nervously in the darkness. They nodded silently, the fear evident in their expressions. We decided to investigate, hoping to find the source of the scream. Armed with flashlights, we cautiously stepped out into the night. The snow crunched under our boots, the beam of our lights cutting through the dense darkness. As we moved deeper into the forest, the howling wind seemed to carry whispers, voices that weren't quite human. Suddenly, we spotted a figure standing several meters away from our tent. It was a man, dressed in an old, tattered coat, his face obscured by the shadows. He stood motionless, staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Without a word, he raised a hand and pointed towards the mountain range, his gesture both a warning and a plea. Before we could react, the figure vanished into the night, swallowed by the swirling snow. The atmosphere grew heavier, the silence once again enveloping us. But now it felt oppressive, filled with an unseen presence. We hurried back to the tent, the image of the mysterious man etched into our minds. The next morning, We tried to brush off the incident as a hallucination caused by the cold and isolation. But as we began to pack up our gear, we noticed small, round footprints leading away from our tent and into the forest. They were unlike any animal tracks we had seen, human-like but unnaturally small and perfectly circular. A sense of dread settled over us as we realized the footprints were heading deeper into the wilderness. Determined to find answers, we decided to follow the trail. The snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the ground in a thick layer of white. As we trekked further, the forest seemed to grow denser, the trees looming ominously above us. The howling wind continued, now joined by a faint, sorrowful moaning that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the mountain. After hours of walking, we stumbled upon the remnants of an old campsite, half buried in snow. The site was eerily familiar. It bore the same signs of struggle and abandonment that matched the local legends of a massacre that had occurred many winters ago. According to village lore, a group of hunters had been caught in a brutal snowstorm, never to return. Their spirits were said to haunt these mountains, forever searching for peace. As we explored the abandoned site, the moaning grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to tremble, and the air grew unbearably cold. The footprints reappeared, circling our group, leading back towards our original campsite. Panic set in as we realized we were being watched. Followed even, we raced back to our tent, the howling wind now sounding like the cries of the lost souls who had perished here. Inside, the temperature had dropped to a life-threatening level. Frost formed on the tent walls, and the fire flickered weakly against the encroaching cold. We huddled together, our breaths visible in the frigid air, as the sound of footsteps began to echo around us, circling the tent. In the dead of night, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Suddenly, the tent flap was ripped open, and a bone-chilling gust of wind blew inside. Through the opening, I saw the same man from before, his eyes now visible, empty voids that seemed to draw me in. He stared at me, his presence exuding an aura of sorrow and anger. "Leave this place," he whispered, his voice a hollow echo that resonated in my mind. "Peace has not been found." Before I could respond, the figure vanished, and the temperature inside the tent rose slightly. The next morning, we were found by a search party, cold and exhausted but alive. We never spoke of that night, but the scars remained etched in our souls. The footprints were never explained, and the legend of the haunted Appalachian Mountain Camp grew even stronger. Years later, I still hear the echoes of that night, the howling wind, the desperate moaning, and the haunting gaze of the lost hunter. The Appalachian Mountains stand tall and indifferent, their secrets buried beneath layers of snow and time. And sometimes, when the winter winds blow just right, I swear I can hear the whispers of the lost souls, forever wandering the frozen wilderness in search of the peace they never found. Story number 5. Whispers in the Snow. I've always been drawn to the solitude that only the wilderness can offer. The vast expanse of Alberta's forests, blanketed in pristine snow, promised an escape from the cacophony of everyday life. In early January of 2012, my friends and I, Sarah, Mike, Jenna, and myself, decided to embark on a camping trip that would forever change our perception of the wilderness. We arrived at the designated campsite just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. The air was crisp, each breath a visible puff in the fading light. Our gear was meticulously packed: tents, sleeping bags, ample supplies, and the essentials for a weekend of adventure. Little did we know, the forest held secrets that were anything but welcoming. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and a heavy blanket of snow began to fall, muffling the sounds of the forest. Inside our tent, the warmth from the portable heater created a comfortable refuge against the biting cold outside. We laughed and shared stories, the flickering light of our lantern casting dancing shadows on the fabric walls. Around midnight, a serene silence enveloped the forest. The usual nocturnal sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl were conspicuously absent. It was in this eerie stillness that we first heard it, a faint, rhythmic knocking at the entrance of our tent. First, we dismissed it as the wind or a branch tapping against the fabric. Probably just the trees swaying, Jenna suggested, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. But the knocking persisted, growing louder and more deliberate with each passing minute. Sarah, ever the brave one, reached for the flashlight and cautiously approached the tent door. "I'm going to check it out," she announced, her voice steady despite the unease settling in our hearts. With a deep breath, she unzipped the tent flap, only to find nothing but the thick, unbroken snow. The air was still, the snowflakes glittering under the beam of her flashlight. Disappointed but relieved, she closed the flap and returned to the tent, her footsteps crunching softly on the frozen ground. As we resumed our conversation, the knocking began again, this time accompanied by a low, mournful moaning that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the forest. Mike, always the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. "Maybe it's an animal, something stuck in the snow," he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. The tension in the tent was palpable. Jenna clutched her sleeping bag tighter, her eyes darting nervously around the space. "I don't like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the persistent knocking and moaning. Suddenly, a chill swept through the tent, the temperature dropping to an unbearable level despite our heater's best efforts. Frost began to form on the tent walls, intricate patterns of ice that shimmered in the dim light. The knocking intensified, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Heart pounding, I mustered the courage to address the intruder. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. Silence followed my plea, the only sound the relentless patter of snow against the tent. Then, without warning, the tent flap was ripped open by a force I couldn't comprehend. Cold air rushed in, and a figure emerged from the darkness, tall, cloaked in white, with eyes that glowed like embers in the night. Before I could react, the figure vanished into the storm, leaving behind only the lingering sense of dread. We stood there, frozen in terror, as the storm outside seemed to come alive, the snow swirling around us in a frenzied dance. Determined to find answers, we decided to investigate the source of the disturbances. Bundling up in our thickest coats, we stepped out into the blinding snow, the wind biting at our faces. The footprints Sarah had seen were small and round, leading deep into the forest before abruptly stopping as if the walker had vanished into thin air. As we followed the trail, the forest around us seemed to grow denser, the trees towering ominously above. The howling wind carried whispers that sent shivers down our spines, voices that seemed to call out our names, urging us to turn back. After what felt like hours, we reached a clearing illuminated by the pale light of the moon. In the center stood an old, abandoned cabin, its windows shattered and doors hanging ajar. The air around it was thick with an oppressive energy, making each step towards it feel like wading through molasses. Inside, the cabin was a frozen tomb. The remnants of past occupants lay encased in ice, frozen expressions of fear etched onto their faces. The temperature was suffocating, each breath a struggle against the icy grip that seemed to hold us in place. In the corner of the room, we saw her, the woman from the tent, her white hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes empty and hollow. She reached out a spectral hand, her voice a haunting echo that reverberated through the cabin. "Why did you take me from my home?" Before we could respond, the room began to shake, the ice cracking and shifting as if the cabin itself was alive. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with sorrow and anger. We turned to flee, but the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. Panic set in as the temperature dropped further, our breaths visible in the frigid air. The woman's lament grew louder, her cries blending with the howling wind outside. Desperate to escape, I searched for a way out, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the frozen door handle. Suddenly, the woman vanished, and the cabin fell silent once more. The ice began to melt, revealing the skeletal remains of those who had once sought refuge here. It was then that we realized the truth: the cabin was a prison, a place where the spirits of the wronged were trapped, forever reliving their torment. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to break the door free, and we stumbled out into the stormy night. The footprints led us back to our tent. But as we turned to leave, we saw them again, small, round footprints circling the tent, disappearing into the forest as if mocking our attempt to escape. We never spoke of that night again, the memory of the frozen castle haunting our dreams. The local villagers confirmed our fears, sharing stories of past campers who had vanished without a trace, their spirits forever bound to the cursed land. Years have passed since that harrowing experience, but the scars remain. Sometimes, on quiet winter nights, I catch a glimpse of a white-clad figure standing at the edge of the forest, her eyes burning with an eternal sorrow. The whispers of the past echo in my mind, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, their secrets buried beneath layers of snow and ice. The frozen castle stands as a testament to the unforgiving nature of the wilderness and the lingering presence of those who never found peace. And as I gaze into the endless expanse of Alberta's snow-covered forests, I can't help but wonder if the spirits still watch from the shadows, waiting for the next group of curious souls to venture into their eternal winter.